Hi, welcome back to Tiny Garage Fabrication for part 2 of our 22RE build series. We left off in episode 1 with having the motor torn down, getting a couple of parts cleaned up, painted, powder coated, and ready for installation. We found that the camshaft was bad, we found that there was a problem with the head bolt, and we found that there was just some extra silicone and stuff like that in the oil pan that shouldn't have been there. There were some decent parts in the engine, mostly the new timing chain and the timing chain guide, so that's good. So let's get to putting that stuff back in, getting the mechanical time in sync, getting the head bolt fixed, the head back on, a new cam, new rocker arms, new powder coated parts, and we'll slam it back in the car, fire it up, and enjoy life. Alright everybody, let's turn 2. You see me putting on the oil pump drive gear, and then the timing chain tensioner, the timing chain guides, left and right, and next up we'll get the timing chain. Now notice the links on the timing chain. There are two clearly marked links on this chain. They're darker than all the rest, and those line up with the dot on the cam gear, and there's a dot on the bottom of the crankshaft gear. Make sure you get those links in the right spot, and then go ahead and thread it through the guides. Now I used a zip tie just to keep everything tight on the gear, just to make sure that it didn't come off as I tighten everything up. Apply a light layer of gasket maker and a paper gasket to the block, and then a light layer of gasket maker to the timing chain cover. A light coating of grease helps the oil pump O-ring stay in place, and then we reinstall the oil pump with all of the correct size and length bolts in the correct holes. Now these have different torque specs based on the size of the fastener, so make sure you look in your book and get those correct. The AC bracket also has bolts that run through the timing chain cover, so we get that installed. Don't forget the bolt on the back side near the water pump. Then we can get to the water pump itself. Once again, thin gasket sealant on the block side, thin layer of gasket sealant on the water pump itself, paper gasket in between, correct length fasteners, torque to spec. I've got a nice new head gasket here, and the head goes on top. Here's the performance camshaft that I got from Melling. It's a stage 2 light street duty, nothing special, but it should be fun. Apply some high zinc break-in oil. This is some Melling Mel Lube, 1400 parts per million zinc. That is very important in an engine like this that basically a solid lifter, but it's metal on metal for the rocker arms. Get that cam set in and torque to spec. And then we can try to get this timing chain on. I had a heck of a time trying to get the tensioner pressed in enough to give me enough slack to get the chain onto the cam. It really is probably the most difficult job on the reinstallation of everything on one of these engines, but I finally got it with a long pry bar. And don't forget the cylinder head to timing chain cover bolt. No need to torque that down just yet. As you can see, if you do, it'll lift the back of the head. Now with the new cam, I need all new rocker arms, so we'll go ahead and take the rocker arm shaft assembly apart, pull off all the old rocker arms, and place in all brand new rocker arms, making sure to reassemble it the way it came apart. There is a decent illustration in the book, but it's a simple process overall. And then we'll add the valve clearance adjuster nuts and screws. Get everything aligned, drop in the head bolts. I'm just snugging them up with my little ratchet here, and then we'll get to torquing them basically from the inside out. There is a specific sequence to torque these bolts listed in the manual. Let's flash back real quick to part 1. This bolt was mysteriously loose. It was barely finger tight, and we will figure out why in part 2. I'll let you know, it's not good. Now I'm turning, doesn't seem to be getting tight, definitely not clicking. not getting tight, staying about the same, but certainly not getting tight. I realize now I may have screwed up big time. I'm thinking about what I do. Do I pull the block out of my 87? Do I pull the block out of my other Celica? What do I do? So, the bolt looked okay. Think about this one for a while. I think the best course of action is to try to torque down all of the other bolts and see if maybe I just missed something. We'll make sure that none of the other bolts are messed up. Let's check them out. Alright, so we've obtained torque on 9 of the 10 head bolts. Let's try with a little bit higher torque here. Still not to spec torque for the head, just so I don't ruin the gasket. Has still no torque on that number 3 bolt. About halfway to spec torque, all the rest are good, which means I'm going to have to do an insert on the block. We'll tape it up to keep metal shavings out. And now I 3D printed a drill guide to ensure that my drill will stay vertical and true, direct with that hole. It's referenced off of the adjacent bolt holes. Goes in place, test it with a bolt, threads right in, that thing is dead centered. We'll set some tape on there, a little flag that tells me how deep to go, based off of the depth function of my calipers. Some drilling and tapping fluid. I will remove the drill guide, which worked awesome, by the way. Tap the block for the helicoil. Now you run it forward a few turns, back it up a little bit, run it forward, back it up. This breaks any chips, and make sure that your threads get cut well with no mistakes. Takes a little bit longer, but it's totally worth the time. I'm about halfway down. There's some junk and schmutz down there. Go ahead and clean it out, as well as clean off the tap itself. Set it back in and we'll wind it down all the way. Make sure we cut all the threads that we can. Clean the hole again with the screwdriver to get the hard parts. A little bit of compressed air just to blow it all out real good. Double check that it's clean. Some red Loctite on the helicoil. We'll set that thing in there with the included driver and the helicoil kit. Once it's below flush, back the driver out, break the tang off with a small wrench, pull that piece out, and the head bolt threads in real nice. Next step is to put the head back on and see if we can obtain torque on all 10 head bolts. Now, as you can read down here, I like to do this in 3 stages. The torque spec is 58 foot-pounds, so I'll start at about 30, and then I'll go to 45 for the second stage, and then I'll go to 58 for the final stage. Alright, celebration, it went. Okay, let's get on with the build. Now on the cam and the rocker arms, I'm applying more of that high zinc engine assembly lube. Now high zinc is absolutely vital for the startup of this engine, as well as the break-in of the cam. If it doesn't get done, you will wipe out your cam or your rocker arms. Next up, we'll set the valve clearance. We're looking for 7 thousandths on the intake and 11 thousandths on the exhaust. Torque that front head bolt, do not forget, and then we'll apply the cam bolt with the distributor drive gear. Install the distributor. Now you'll want to set this thing clockwise a little bit because it will spin anti-clockwise as it meshes with the distributor gear. You want to get it so that the rotor points more or less towards the number 1 spark plug, and then that should be roughly in time enough to start the engine. Once again with the gasket sealant on both sides of the gasket, we'll get this beautiful powder coated lower intake manifold in place. Get all of its bolts in and torqued to spec. Now we can lay the fuel rail and the fuel injectors that I cleaned in one of my previous videos. Got a really cool video on how to do fuel injectors in your home garage for less than $5 worth of parts to do a really satisfactory clean. Get the wiring harness laid in and then put on the upper intake plenum. Get those bolts in, torqued to spec, and let's move on to the crown jewel of this little 22R. This beautiful wrinkle red powder coated valve cover. That combination looks so good, the wrinkle red valve cover with the wrinkle black intake. It's kind of my trademark. You will see that a lot on my channel. Make sure to subscribe and don't miss any of those. Now the rear main seal, this thing was dry, dilapidated. I guarantee it leaked. I mean, it's just flaking apart in my hands. The seal simply pops out of that ring and a new one just kind of pushes in. Next up, I'm going to pull the clutch pilot bearing. Now this thing broke two of the tools from my puller, so I welded a bolt to it and used a larger, chunkier piece and ran that sucker out of there. Thin coat of grease on the inside of the rear main helps for your initial startup. Then go ahead and send that thing home, torque to spec, and then we'll put this thing back on the engine stand to put the oil pan on. Now there's just some ultra black gasket sealer on there. For the 85 and up 22REs, you don't need a cork gasket. The 82 to 84s you do. Well, that's recommended anyway. Go ahead and torque this thing down in a crisscross pattern, and then we'll pull it off the engine stand again to install the transmission shim plate, followed by the flywheel. A little bit of Loctite on all of the flywheel bolts. We'll send those things home. Find a way to hold the flywheel so you can torque those to spec. I used a breaker bar clamped to two of the clutch pressure plate dowel pins. I'll drive in a new clutch pilot bearing, followed by the clutch with the install tool. The clutch pressure plate, there are 6 bolts. You want to tighten these evenly and slowly in a crisscross pattern, constantly checking that your installation tool slides freely. If there's any bind on that, it means your clutch is not centered concentrically and you will not be able to install your transmission. Trust me, the input shaft will bind and it will not go in. Now, this is the part it would be really nice to have somebody to help you with, is installing the transmission, because it's heavy and wiggly, but I got it figured out. Ready to put this thing in. I know I pulled it out without the transmission. I put it in with the transmission. It's easier to align. I did just pull the transmission out from the bottom of the car, dropped the cross member, dropped the jack it was on, came right out. Anyway, with an engine leveling tool on my engine crane, this thing goes in pretty easily. Got to line up the motor mounts and make sure that the shifter base on the tail shaft of the transmission doesn't hang up on the firewall too much, and it's a pretty easy installation. Now we'll go everything, double check it all real quick, and apply some power, apply some fuel, and see if we can get this thing to start. Alright, not having too much luck. It does sound like it's just not quite in time, so we'll get out here and we'll screw with the distributor a little bit, move it back and forth, see what works best. Alright, doesn't appear that direction worked right, so we'll move it the other direction. Almost. I mean, technically it's running? Sort of? Yeah, no, that sucks. Let's try again. Now I'm out of room with the distributor there, so it appears as if I didn't get the rotor quite set when I put it in initially. So I'll pull it out, move it clockwise just a little bit, roughly one more tooth, stick it back in, put the cap back on, and then we will try again. There we go. I think we can work with that. Here I've got the timing light hooked up to the number 1 cylinder. We will jump the timing connector, which takes the computer control out of it, set it to 5 degrees as per the emissions label. Timing is set, but she still doesn't run right. There's clearly a misfire in one of the cylinders. Using my infrared gun, I was able to tell it was cylinder number 1. Here for proof, we'll pull spark plug number 1, and it runs exactly the same. I thought it had batch fire injection, so I figured that 1 and 3 were kind of paired together. So I pulled number 3 as well, and it runs even worse now, which means that cylinder 3 was firing. So it's not a batch fire issue, and just to prove the point, we'll pull cylinder number 2, and it still runs just as bad. Toyota wiring harnesses were notorious on the 22RE for open crimp connectors in the wiring harness. On the 12-volt power side coming from the resistor box, there were 2 open crimps. They just had some tape wrapped around them, but these were known to corrode, and sometimes the wires would fall off. There's those crimps. A solution is to cut those crimps out, solder and heat shrink everything. And then also on the ground side coming from the ECU, which is your signal to fire the injectors, those also had open crimps in the harness. So here I'm cutting those clips out, soldering everything, running heat shrink. A little bit of dielectric grease inside the heat shrink also helps waterproof these. And then we'll put the harness back together and see if that solved our problem. Unfortunately, it did not. I still have a misfire. It's running a lot smoother. The engine's nice and warmed up. I did a 20-minute cam break-in between 1500 and 2000 RPM. And now I'm using a screwdriver to listen to the injectors themselves. You can hear a very audible tick from the injectors that are firing, and I can absolutely tell that number 1 is not firing. And here's the reason why. The connectors inside the plug were backed out a little bit. I noticed this when I went to put my Noid light on that injector to find out why it wasn't firing. But a real quick push of the terminals, and we've got ourselves a smooth running engine, 4 injectors firing, 4 cylinders doing what they do. That took a little bit longer than I expected it to. The engine didn't behave the way I wanted it to on initial startup. However, I was able to get the cam broken in. Wiring, gremlins, what are you gonna do? Even though I went through the harness and checked those crimp connectors, turns out even that wasn't the issue with this problem. And the entire time, from the time I looked at the car when I bought it, to ran it in my driveway and fired it up after the rebuild, it was nothing but a fuel injector connector. You know, sometimes you just miss the small stuff, and that's okay. I was able to find it, able to fix it super easy with nothing but a razor blade and a little bit of tape. Now it's just to slit the harness and tape it back up after I push the connectors in place. As for the wiring harness though, you can see I did not completely retape or relume it. That's because it's probably going to get torn into again, and the fuel injector connectors are going to get replaced, and that's because I'm going to put upgraded fuel injectors in, as well as some new wiring in the harness because I'm going to run an aftermarket ECU. That's right, we're going to micro squirt this thing. It's going to have LS2 coils, proper batch fire instead of all 4 at once, and we'll get into all that stuff. There will be a video involved. I'll show you how I'm going to make the crank trigger, how I'm going to run the ECU, how I'm going to delete the distributor. All that cool stuff will come up in a future episode. So please subscribe, like, comment, stay tuned. That's all I got for you. Thanks, everybody.